Before we dive in, here's another show you can enjoy in the True Story FM family of entertainment podcasts.
Ever wonder where the devil got his horns?
How about those cloven hooves?
Or that pitchfork?
Wasn't he an angel?
No, he was a snake.
No, he's the great red dragon.
No, he's the beast.
He's the prince of this world.
Prince of darkness.
Well, he's the prince of dark.
Good morning, star lovelies. One of my names is Lester Ryan Clark.
And I sometimes go by Keenan Diaz.
And we're the hosts of the brand new podcast, The Devil's Details. What comes to mind when I say Lucifer?
How about Satan?
What about just the devil? How did the big bad of the Western world end up with so many faces? Join us as we dig up, decipher, and deconstruct the devil's many forms throughout history.
Take a guided tour with Dante through the 9 circles of hell.
Or revisit Satan's angsty bad boy years in Paradise Lost.
Learn the ins and outs of a Faustian contract.
Easier than a 1099, but with a hell of a lot more fine print.
Slither on over to The Devil's Details on True Story FM and join us in the diabolic discussion.
Love and hisses. Mwah! Didn't Al Pacino play him in a movie?
Are you sure that wasn't Robert De
I could
Niro?
have sworn it was Tim Curry.
That was Elizabeth
Didn't
Hurley.
he go down to Georgia at some point?
Hey, psst. Hey, you see that Snickers over there? If no one's looking, you should just take it.
No! Don't listen to him, my son. That would be stealing, and stealing is a sin.
Sin Schmin, it's a freaking Snickers bar. You deserve to have it. Sinning really satisfies you.
Repent, my child. Virtue is the only real snack worth savoring. For that candy bar is merely a gateway to nougat damnation. Has this ever happened to you?
Listening to the devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other, and you're not sure what to think?
Then we're here to help. I'm Pete Wright.
And I'm Tommy Metz III, and this season on All the Feelings, we're examining the 7 deadly sins
You know, the fun ones,
and the 7 heavenly virtues.
which are also a thing. Through personal stories, historical oddities, and way too much embarrassment, we take you on a thrilling journey through all the goods and the bads you hear about in church.
But without all that pesky church stuff. So come join us for All the Feelings Season 9, a sometimes funny podcast about being human. All the sins, all the virtues.
All in one place. Go to allthefeelings.fun to learn more or subscribe to All the Feelings wherever you get your podcasts.
Game over.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that is inspired by the recent TV show Andor, Star Wars Andor, so there will be some spoilers for that, but that also has relevance to a lot of the other properties we discuss and frankly to our own world, which is namely, how do we understand power and authority under fascism, and how do we judge the different individuals who are part of that? Looking primarily at the character of Syril, but also looking at a number of others from Andor Season 2 and Season 1. And some other properties as well. And let me kind of just start by framing a couple of things. First of all, I think one of the problems with the way a lot of this gets discussed online is we've gotten to a point where fascism and authoritarianism are pretty much mixed up as one and the same thing. And we're not going to go deep into the details here, but I do think and a lot of what we say I think is going to apply to general authoritarianism as well. But one of the elements of fascism is a strong individual leader around whom there's often a kind of cult of personality of some sort or a reverence for that one true leader that is often, but not always, found in authoritarianism. And that's going to be a big element of what we're talking about today. So one to kind of just, make that distinction, because I do think that those terms, as well as Nazism, are often all rolled up as the same term, and I think they are 3 distinctly different things, though fascism is a kind of authoritarianism and Nazism is a kind of fascism, but etc. With that, though, let's now kind of talk about the actual issues we're going to be jumping into. Riki, can you give us kind of just a quick summary of the journey that Syril goes through? For people who haven't watched Andor and are not going to, or just are not going to for a while, I do recommend you do so. And if you can't hit stop, even if you don't like Star Wars at all, this is one of the most un-Star Wars-like shows. It's much more like political thriller or spy thriller, but where they're laser bolts instead of bullets. But Riki, give us a quick rundown of what is Syril's journey in this show that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, so Syril Karn is the character played by Kyle Soller on this show, and he begins the show as a corporate security officer, inspector. He's a cop. And he's kind of like sub-imperial. He's not directly tied to the empire, but this corporation, Primor, is kind of subservient to the empire. And they, at the beginning, they get to do their own thing, but there's this worry that imperial authority will come in and take over at some point, which they do. And so he begins this journey as a cop who is investigating the murder of two fellow security officers on a planet by the main character of the show, Cassian Andor. And he goes and he figures out that Andor is the suspect in this case and goes to arrest him and basically causes an incident on Andor's home planet, Ferrix, is disarmed by Andor and is at the time not quite yet compatriot Luthen Rael, held at gunpoint, disarmed, and then they escape. And this starts his obsession with Andor.
Right.
He loses his job over this incident because it's a whole screw up.
Right.
And that also fuels him too. Is like I lost my job because of him. Like he murdered two people and got away. And even though he gets a different job back on Coruscant, he's constantly obsessed with Andor. When he gets news that Andor's mother has died, he's like, aha, like I'm gonna come for the funeral. He's gonna show up. I'm gonna get him. And that's how season 1 ends. And in season 2, at this point now, he is in a romantic relationship with Dedra Miro, who is the ISB supervisor.
ISB is the Imperial Security Bureau.
Yes.
It's the CIA, the KGB of the Galactic Empire.
And through her operation on a planet called Gorman, he becomes a spy for the Empire, albeit a very amateurish one. But for him, like someone who was a cop and has always kind of aspired to this lifestyle and this type of job, like he loves it. He's like, I get to be a spy. At one point when he meets Dedra's boss, he says, this is the best day of my life. Right. And I laughed. It was kind of funny and a little sad to me. And I think we're going to talk about this.
Very much so.
And this is a huge spoiler for a thing that happens in season 2. So again, like if you are interested in the show and you haven't caught up yet, at this point you might want to pause the podcast and go watch the show because it's amazing. So I'm going to get to the spoiler now, which is that Syril basically participates in an Imperial operation to instigate a riot on Gorman, which leads to a massacre in a plaza, and ultimately what they call the Gorman massacre or Gorman genocide.
Right. And
in this moment, when he realizes that his girlfriend Dedra has been lying to him about what's been going on and what his role in this whole thing is, he goes into shock.
Right.
And does some things that we will also talk about. And it's hard to tell what he's thinking, right? Like we don't get any dialogue or internal monologue, but he walks out of Dedra's office in shock, walks out into the plaza where the massacre begins, and just like stands there shell-shocked until he sees the object of his obsession over 2 seasons, Cassian Andor. And he snaps out of it and he goes and gets in a fist fight with him. And shortly after that, he is killed. And that's his journey.
Yeah, I think it's a great summary. Just a couple of quick things I want to fill in. First of all, what you said before about these sort of security forces, a book that I'm reading right now that's going to inform a lot of these conversations, and I think is a one I definitely recommend people reading, especially if you like history, is a book called The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire.
Oh, yeah.
And
I read that.
Yeah, it's written as though it is a history book written by people in the Star Wars universe shortly after the events of the sequel trilogy, looking back on the Galactic Empire. And there's one paragraph that talks about exactly this, and it talks about how there are these security groups and that they are interested in keeping up the law, but one of the things they're also very interested in is avoiding the Empire getting more involved. And it starts here. Imperial training may have prepared stormtroopers for many things, but they were little more than a blunt instrument designed for subjugation rather than a more nuanced governing force. The fear of having them deployed to a system, tipping it from being governed into being occupied, which I think is a really great sentence, could cool even the hottest tempers among those who found themselves on the wrong side end of shifting imperial laws. Furthermore, the security forces themselves were equally keen to avoid active imperial scrutiny or involvement in their affairs, because as it goes on, it would cut their budgets and their power. And that's exactly why Syril gets into trouble, because, and I think it reveals so much about his character, and here's where I think becomes a really important thing to understand about fascism. He is the person, what he wants is law and order. He truly believes that strict authoritarian government will make everybody safer, will make things better. And because what he understands is that 2 police officers, 2 of the people kind of under his watch, were killed by this murderer, Cassian Andor. He doesn't want to listen to what his boss tries to... His boss figures the whole thing out like 30 seconds, and predicts like these guys were probably corrupt, they were probably shaking down Cassian. Syril doesn't want to hear any of that. He just sees a man killed 2 people, and we've got to track down that man. And here's at least as I understand it, and Ricky, please jump in if you see it differently. I think what his story is one of, he has believed the lie that this fascist authoritarian government will bring law and order and will make everything right. And what he understands that's happening in Gorman is that the Empire is making completely rational demands of a planet under its control, and the people are being terrorists, and they're fighting back in bad ways, and that's not okay, and so they have to be repressed. And what he comes to understand is that no, actually the Empire has set all this up because they want to destroy the people of Gorman, because they want to basically completely strip mine the planet for its minerals in ways that would destroy it as a place, and all the people couldn't live there to begin with. And so for him, that's the moment of recognizing this empire is not actually ending corruption. They're not draining the swamp. They are the swamp. They are just as corrupt as anything else. And for me, at least, I see this very much as kind of the Javert story from Les Mis.
Mm-hmm.
Why he goes after... is for him, it's that moment where everything you've believed in has been shattered. All the things because he has a very rigid view of the world, and rigid worldviews are often very brittle, and they can break. And when it breaks, that's why he goes after Cassian, because that's kind of that, as you said, that's the very beginning of this is a murderer in his mind that he can stop. And yeah, it places him in this really interesting position where I think we are, and part of this is because of that actor who was just phenomenal. We feel some sympathy for him in that moment of like his world has collapsed. He's realized the lie he's told, and he's acting out based on that. But what he acts out to do it is he tries to strangle his girlfriend, Dedra, who's betrayed him, and then he goes after the man who he thinks is a murderer and is eventually put down.
Yeah, a lot of good points there. Definitely the law, like the Syril believes in law and order thing is one
Right.
thing that comes up constantly in discussion. And the most important thing to me about that phrase law and order is that it leaves out the word justice,
Yes.
right? Which often you combine ideas of justice and law together. And I think that's so important because the empire is the law, because they literally write the laws and they enforce them, they enforce order, but they are deeply unjust as an entity, right? I mean, that's just, I don't think we can argue that. And because of that, there's this point that if you are enforcing unjust law, then you're that's not good, right? Like we would say evil in this case, in the case of the empire. And you can draw various lines of morality, but when it comes down to it, like just unjust laws shouldn't be enforced. And that's like this question of like phrases like I was only following orders, right? Like orders are laws within like a military structure.
Right.
So if you're following the law, like what's wrong? Well, the orders, the laws you're given are unjust, and that's a problem. And you need to center on a different scale of morality and make decisions based on that if the law is unjust.
And I think such a big part of there is that is both like a law can be unjust and also a law can be unjustly applied. And I think that's a lot of what he goes through is that I think he comes with the assumption that I think a lot of times you hear from people who want law and order is what they want is impartial law and order. They want like, here's the law, if you follow it, you're okay. If you don't, you're not. And it's easy to enforce, that it should be very easy to say we don't need all these courts. We don't need all this due process because it's just if you follow the law, you're good. If you don't, you're bad. And we don't get as much of Syril's backstory as we got with some other characters. For example, some of the characters in the novel Lost Stars that we love to talk about. That is another phenomenal piece of Star Wars media. But in that and in a lot of other things, and also in this book, the History of the Empire that we're talking about, one of the things that's talked about a lot is that there was chaos after the Clone Wars, that things were crazy, that there was no law and order. And this is very much a hallmark of how authoritarianism, especially fascism, can take hold. It is after periods of chaos where there are people breaking the law throughout. There is terrible corruption. There is all of these things. And someone comes along and says, I can make it right. I can make sure that you feel safe again. I can make sure that you feel okay again and that you get your fair shot. And what I think this show kind of illustrates brilliantly is not only is it fascism will manipulate those fears, but they'll also create those fears to begin with. Like they will make people feel a lot more unsafe than they actually are in order to sell the lie of we will therefore make you safe. You need to be really scared of this ethnic group so that therefore this gender group or this whatever it is, so that therefore we can keep you safe from them. And that's something that I fully believe that Syril has that for whatever reason, we don't get that backstory, but he thinks we need this kind of law and order. And that's his, anyway, I feel like he feels kind of like a Shakespearean tragic hero, not that he's a hero necessarily, but that he has that, like, his story, I think more than anything else, is a tragedy. We feel bad for all the people Macbeth killed, and there's no way in which we think Macbeth is going to be a good king of Scotland, but and I hope you're not listening to this in a theater. Forgive me, I've said all that word so many times, but we still feel a tragedy about Macbeth. And I think in many ways that's what Syril's story is it's tragic because you see how much harm this man has caused to all these others, and it does come to himself as well, and it's because he believed these lies.
Yeah, you mentioned that we don't get necessarily a backstory on Syril. Like, we certainly don't have any flashbacks of him growing up, but I do think that there was one very interesting detail that the prop department just slipped in. But when he comes back to his home on Coruscant, and goes back to live with his mother, in his room he has several action figures that look like either stormtroopers or maybe like clone trooper armor, like the white armor.
Right. Yeah.
And it's just a small thing. Like, we all played with toys, but I do think, like, in this case, they put it in intentionally to show, like, he played with these action figures of these troopers.
Yeah.
And that is something that we can say is, has made his character.
Yeah.
Made him who he is today, is this person who believes in law and order to this degree.
I love the idea that, because it's not just that he believes in law and order, but it's kind of like he has swallowed the propaganda of his world, because he believes in the law and order, and he believes in the fundamental goodness of the people who are enforcing law and order. Like, he does not want to listen when his boss on his first planet points out all the ways in which these cops that Cassian killed might have actually really not been the good guys in this situation. He doesn't want to hear that. And he doesn't want to pay any attention to the evidence that maybe Dedra and the others in the ISB are not actually really as good and proper and upright as he wants them to be. He's fully dedicated to these people are saying the right things, and so I will not believe the bad things about them.
Yeah. And I just want to clarify, like, again, like, many of us growing up had action figures, army figures, G.I. Joe, that type of thing. And I'm not saying, like, if you have them as a kid, you turn into this type of person. But, like, there's intentionality to television programs. Right. And especially in this case, he is an adult. He still has these items. And when he comes home, like, I think he specifically, like, holds one and looks at it. Right. And to me, that is the people writing this saying, like, this is kind of what he still aspires to.
Right.
Like, he's having these memories, and it's like, like, I lost my cop job.
Right. Yeah, and he eventually gets a position in just kind of the Imperial bureaucracy in the Department of Standards.
Yeah,
and
like
it's
fuel standards.
Yeah, we're somewhat like they're investigators, but somewhat they're also just like propagating these standards. And he immediately wants to do it in a police-like way. He wants to
Oh yeah,
get the people
he's a
who are
bookkeeper, but later on we see him bragging about how he caught people stealing from the Empire.
Yep, exactly. So let's broaden the lens a little bit. Why does someone like Syril exist in this system, and what do you think we can learn from his story and some of the stories of the other individuals who we meet through this show and through other things about the way power works under the Empire?
Well, there's a through line of his character. I still want to talk a little bit about Cyril, but start to veer into other places.
Uh-huh.
Because you mentioned earlier that when Dedra admits what's going on Gorman, or to get her to admit, I think, Cyril resorts to violence. As you said, he chokes her. It's a very uncomfortable scene, but I think it's an important scene to illustrate his character and why I feel like he's not a good person, right? Like at his core, because in this moment, this is his girlfriend, and he resorts to this violence that is very personal, and it made me uncomfortable. And then later on, when he's in the square, one thing I keep coming back to is that he sees people dying all around him, being shot by the Imperial stormtroopers, and he doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
He doesn't help anyone. He doesn't try to get people to cover. Like, he's in shock, but he like that to me is like a moment of decision where people want him to be a hero. They're like, oh, like he could have joined the rebellion if only. But he doesn't do it. He could have joined the rebellion if he had saved human lives in that moment.
Yeah.
And instead, what snaps him out of his shock is seeing Cassian. And again, he resorts to violence. He goes and attacks him. So that to me is like why I don't see Cyril as any kind of like heroic person or anti-hero or whatever. Like, I agree with your assessment of tragic character, but every decision he makes in these moments is towards violence, is towards oppression.
Yeah.
And he pays this lip service when he's talking to Dedra of like, look what you're doing to the Gorman people. But then he doesn't lift a finger to help the Gorman people.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree with everything you just said. I think he's by no means heroic. I think it's that I took Shakespeare class 35 years ago. I don't remember I think the term that's often used for the protagonist of a Shakespearean tragedy, I think is tragic hero. I don't remember. There might be a better term, but I definitely don't. I think he is similar to a protagonist of a Shakespearean tragedy. I don't think he's heroic in the slightest. And I think the moments that you just pointed out, those are the moments of decision where a hero could make the heroic choice.
Yeah.
You know, where he could pick up the gun and start fighting on behalf of the people of Gorman, where he could look at Cassian and recognize that Cassian's actually doing the right thing and sort of have that moment. Or where he could take the Javert route even of like, he's going to die, you know, not just off himself necessarily, unalive himself, but like do something that will probably get him killed, but can help do some good. Maybe even better than Javert. But he doesn't do any of that. He resorts back to that core philosophy that, as you said, is incredibly violent and is incredibly focused on, I know what is right and wrong, and I'm not going to let anything else challenge that. And yeah, that's it. To me, he has the option to become heroic, and he chooses not to. And to me, that's the tragedy of his character.
Yeah. And I will note for those of you who are shouting this at your podcast player right now, in that moment, Cassian Andor, the protagonist, potentially hero of this story, also is not helping to save lives. He's
True.
there to assassinate Dedra, the ISB supervisor, and I think there's some questions as to whether Cyril realizes that Cassian is aiming his gun at Dedra or not. Like, it's not explicitly shown, so we can kind of draw our own personal conclusions. But Cassian is definitely not saving lives either, like in a
that's fair.
personal sense. Like, you could make the argument that if he succeeds in assassinating Dedra, then lives will be saved. But that's kind of a different discussion.
Yeah, no, actually, that's a really good point, and thank you for that. He's and that goes to some of the larger questions we'll discuss probably another issue of like, you know, what is the role of rebellion in terms of like whether to protect the people who are being hurt right now or a larger strategic but hurtful strategy or whatever it is. I'm solidly on the side of I don't think Syril knew, because I think there would have been an establishing shot of some kind of like him looking at where the barrel is pointed or something. But you're
Yeah,
right, it is left somewhat ambiguous.
which is good because I do think that's an interesting thing that if you believe that, like if you believe that in his last moments, like he snapped out of it because he was trying to save Dedra, like
Mhm.
that's fine. Like that's an interpretation that you're allowed to make based on what we're shown.
Yeah, I agree with that. But let's broaden it out a little bit more. What do you see as happening in terms of like what is it about the Empire that and the way it uses power that creates people like Syril? Because I don't think he is supposed to be an exception. I think the idea is that there's a lot of Cyrils out there.
Yeah, I mean, well, so you talked about how fascism is about the central strong figure,
Right.
right? In the classic real life historical sense, we have the examples of Adolf Hitler and Mussolini. And in the fictional world of Star Wars, we have the Emperor, Emperor Sheev Palpatine, who is the leader of the Empire. And so all authority derives from the central leader, right? Like, and it is distributed among subordinates, but ultimately, like, it all goes back to the top, which arguably is similar to the rule of two for the Sith, right? In
Right.
Star Wars, that there's a master and an apprentice. And so the power derives from the master, and the apprentice is trying to seek that power and overthrow the master. The difference I see in the Empire and in fascism is that the leader is never going to let any of his subordinates amass enough power to overthrow him. And in fact, like the system is designed so that all of the subordinates are fighting each other rather than trying to overthrow the leader. And we see this throughout Star Wars, and it's brilliant. The way that men like Grand Moff Tarkin and director Krennic basically like snipe at each other, or
Mm-hmm.
Thrawn and Krennic, right? In the cartoon Rebels, the way that they are jockeying for funds for their individual projects is all to keep the subordinates fighting so that none of them can amass enough power and authority to challenge the emperor. And we see, like in this show in Andor, it's primarily from the perspective of the ISB, the Security Bureau,
Right.
the spy organization. And it's is he the director, Partagaz?
I think
He's
he's
the
certainly
guy in
director of
charge of the room.
a part. Yeah, Colonel Yularen is the overall head of the ISB, but he's in charge of this portion of it.
Right. And he's in charge of the sector directors. And
Right.
Dedra is the director of one specific sector. And so there's constantly these scenes in the ISB room where she is overstepping the bounds of her sector to investigate things like Cassian.
Right.
And sometimes like the other directors like, this is my sector, like get out.
Right.
And there's this constant infighting in these groups.
And I think it's brilliant because the show winds up, without hitting you over the head with it, making it clear that that's a big part of why the system fails. Because when Dedra goes to try to arrest Luthen, I mean, she does arrest Luthen, part of why it turns into a disaster is because everyone else has been playing these territory games with her, and she has to play them right back. And so she doesn't want to go to the other people and say, I know this part of the story, you know that part of the story, let's coordinate and work together, because she knows that they'll probably steal the credit from her. And for her mind, that's what has to happen, is that she needs to get the credit, and she gets punished for that. But if she had been successful, she would have absolutely been rewarded. You know, she was playing the game right, she just didn't win. And if you win, you get punished for it. If you don't win, you get punished for it. And I think that was there's a lot about how, like, you know, fascism sows the seeds of its own destruction, as long as there are people strong enough to kind of recognize that and see that and fight back. And this is absolutely what happens here. I thought it was one of the most brilliant things of showing that, like, that infighting happens on the level of Tarkin and Krennic, with Vader kind of as a mediator almost, but it also happens at a much lower level between these like sector chiefs, and it also happens at a much lower level between like the grunts on the ground in the various battles we see.
Yeah, absolutely. To me, I mean, I loved everything about this show, but being able to see that play out on this level, the infighting between the ISB directors was maybe one of my favorite parts. I don't know. It's hard. It's hard to say, and it draws into contrast with how the rebellion operates. Right, the rebellion also fights and bickers a lot. We see a lot of arguments among the leaders, like including Mon Mothma and Luthen, about how to run the rebellion, but they don't undercut each other, right?
Right.
They disagree, sometimes strongly, but one of the most powerful scenes from this season, in the first arc, was when Mon and Luthen at the wedding are talking about Tay Kolma and what to do about him. And Luthen basically says, I'm going to kill him. Like, I have to kill him to protect you. And Mon is like, but he's my oldest friend. Like, but she doesn't agree to it, but she doesn't object in the end.
Right.
And to me, like, that is the difference right
Yeah.
there between the Empire and the Rebellion, is that they have this disagreement, they discuss it openly or semi-openly, and then she's like, yeah, all right, I'm just gonna walk away, get drunk at this wedding and dance and try to forget this.
And I think that's wonderfully paid off, because in the final arc then, the second of last arc and then the final arc, Luthen, who's been critical of Mon Mothma throughout both seasons, he's constantly harping on her and saying she's not doing the right things. He still recognizes she's the leader that the rebellion needs and risks everything to get her out. And then to get his subordinate, his pseudo-daughter, Clara, to also go with her. Clea, thank you. And why don't you go back to one thing about kind of the low levels of power here? Because I think one of the thing I think that breaks Syril, that I think is an essential thing to understand about the Empire and about fascism in general, is as much as it will claim, authority and right, and we're not being woke, we're not looking at factors, we're just being impartial, there really is a might makes right idea to it, and that at the end of the day, it's about the whim of the emperor, and then the whims of the people below him, all the way down to the bottom. And there's a great quote, and I'm going to read this from The Rise and Fall of the Empire and then tie it back to the show. And it said, if Tarkin had survived the Galactic Civil War, he would undoubtedly have faced a new Republic tribunal. But we should not ignore the fact that much of the Empire's evil did not take place in the towers of Coruscant, just as the Rebel Alliance was more than just Princess Leia and Mon Mothma's leadership. We should not overlook the activities of those at the very grassroots of galactic society. Just as anyone could potentially be a hero in the rebellion, so too could anyone be a monster in Palpatine's empire. And I bring this up because I think one of the most controversial scenes in this second season, and also some of the online reaction to it, which is the attempted sexual assault on Bix, who she then is able to kill. And a lot of people were upset about this. A lot of people didn't like seeing it. And some of the reaction was like, no, Vader would never allow this in his empire, etc. And I think there's some questions about gender and how often this is this kind of scene that's shown to show women who are traumatized. And I think I'm not the right one to comment on it. But from my perspective, I think it was a very important and wonderful scene, because it shows exactly what this quote is about. That in that moment, I don't think there's any kind of imperial directive of, women can be treated this way or not treated this way under these kind of conditions. Instead, it's someone who has learned who I think understands the Empire much better than Syril does, because they understand the Empire has decided that these people, who by the way are undocumented farm workers, the analogy does not fall very far, that they can be treated however we want, because we are the ones with power and might makes right. And so this person is taking advantage of that to take what he wants, or to try to. Bix kills him, and again, a wonderful ending to the scene. But to me, that is such an important statement about the nature of fascism and the nature of authoritarianism in these kind of situations, of when you tell people that, no, actually, this isn't about impartiality. It is about, you are the ones with authority, you are the ones with the gun, you are the ones with the badge, you get to do what you think is right. There's almost no oversight over that, and they get to do what they think they want to do, including horrible treatment of people who the Empire has said you can treat however you want.
Yeah, the argument that Imperial authority wouldn't allow this, like, is a law and order argument, right? Like, it's against the law. Like, sexual assault is against the law, just as Cyril's like murder is against the law. But as you said, like, this man is the Imperial authority on this planet, or at least like in this part of the planet,
Mhm.
doing this audit of the population. And so I guess the phrase would be, I am the law, right? That in this part of the galaxy, this man gets to decide what the law is and do whatever the heck he wants. And that is the characteristic of authoritarianism.
100%. 100%.
It's it's a stunning scene. Stunning not in like beautiful, stunning in like you will be stunned. It's shocking, I guess is a better word.
Mhm.
And I do think it plays out well, because when it was happening, I had concerns about, because Wilmon, her friend, was coming back to their
Mhm.
farm. So it's like, oh, is he gonna save her? No, like she saves herself. She has
Yeah.
the agency and kills the man herself. Wilmon does save her by shooting, I think, one of the other officer who's outside,
Right.
right? So there was that, but I don't think it was like he was the white knight of this
Right.
situation. So I think it was written well to give her the agency, just as like the other arc where he goes for Dr. Gorst, the man who tortured her in season
Mhm.
1 with the sound waves.
Yep.
That she gets her revenge on him personally. Like, I
Yeah.
think those were very important things for her character.
Yeah. No, very much so. Very much so. And as well as the like sort of peaceful ending that she gets. And I think there's rightfully some discussion about, you know, her having a child at that point, and I've made my thoughts on that clear in the Star Wars episode. But yeah, no, I very much agree with that she gets. And I just love that she didn't die. You know, that I think that was such the cliche that a lot of us were preparing for. But what else? What else do we want to talk about in terms of the way that this show, or just this question in general of how we see power manifest with these individuals? And I'll actually kind of, I was posing that as a question, but I'll kind of just jump in with, I think what I like so much about this show, and it's something I think you've said to me at times when we've talked about the show in Instant Messenger and the like, is it humanizes the people in the Empire. And there's a degree to which you want to just hate people that are part of this. And I think that the original Star Wars movie allows us to do that. The fact is that the stormtroopers are literally nameless, faceless automatons that look like robots almost, that don't get to have a human face. And therefore we can feel okay with Han Solo and Luke and Leia killing them by the hundreds and blowing them up, you know, no matter how many of them are on there. I think there's a time and place for that, a time and place for like, we need to fight evil and all these people are that. But I think it also becomes very easy to then, you know, this is kind of almost the mission statement of this podcast a lot of the times. I like villains who challenge us, who make us wonder, like, would we make similar choices to what Syril does or what Daedra does? And how do we not do that? And how do we help teach people to not do that? Because it is clearly so easy for people to do that. And I think there's been a perspective a lot of the time that if you are becoming sympathetic towards a villain can mean whitewashing them or defending them. And I think there's definitely a problem with that in Star Wars. You know, there are people out there who will tell you Anakin did nothing wrong and it was entirely someone else's fault.
Right, right.
And I think that's ludicrous. But then I think you get the opposite of, no, Anakin was just always pure evil and there's nothing anyone could do. And I think, like, I was amazed that in that moment when he realizes he has failed and he will be killed and he needs to just unalive himself, I felt a moment of sympathy for Pendergast.
Partagas?
Perry, thank you. Yeah. I'm terrible with names. I apologize. We all know this. When Daedra is in that prison that looks an awful lot like the prison Cassian was in season 1, and she just puts her head in her hands because she's so broken and defeated. I was I was ready to be excited about her being sent off to the Death Star to die. And I felt bad for her in that moment. To me, that's just brilliant storytelling, because it doesn't mean we are sympathetic to that. It doesn't mean we're defending them. It doesn't mean we think that they're not as awful as they are, but they're still human. They're still people. They're still sentient beings. And if we can have those moments of sympathy for them, it's because we can relate to them, which means we have to look more at ourselves and be more vigilant about how do we not become these villains.
Yeah, I think Syril and Daedra are both great characters,
Mm-hmm.
And I I guess I'll use the word like. I like them as characters in that they are enjoyable to watch their journey,
Yeah.
but I don't think that they're good people at all.
Yeah.
And that's the balance you have to have. And as you said, like we shouldn't excuse their actions, right? And that's why I focused in on Cyril's actions of violence. Like in those moments, like he chose violence instead of choosing to help.
Right.
And I think Dedra is also interesting. Both of these characters, as you are watching this show, at least for me, there were legitimate moments where I was like, is this where they change? Is this where they join the rebellion? Like, especially Syril, right? In those last
Right.
moments when he realizes what's happening on Gorman, I think a lot of us were like, this is it. This is he's finally he's gonna see Cassian and be like, I was wrong, like I want to join. Like that
Yeah.
that was a possibility in our minds. And it didn't happen, and I'm glad it didn't happen. Because as much as that was something I was thinking of, like that, I don't think that's what his journey should have been. I'm very
Yeah.
satisfied with how his journey ended.
We
And
love Zuko. We love the people who do have the God, what's the word? Not
Redemptions.
retribution, redemption stories. But I like being reminded that that should be the exception, not the rule. That most of the time that isn't what happens.
and it has to be earned.
100%.
And same thing with Dedra. After the Gorman arc, and in the show, like the 3 episode arcs are each a year apart,
Yep.
basically. After the Gorman arc, when we come back, I think some people were like, well, surely after she participates in that, she will turn away from the Empire. Because at the end of that arc, she has a moment where she is basically like having a breakdown and maybe crying, right, over what's happening. And so, like, yeah, like she's human and she has these emotions and feels that. And many of us thought, okay, well, now like she's going to join the rebellion. And it didn't happen. And again, I'm satisfied. I'm satisfied with where she ended up. I felt there was like a very good parallel between her final scene and the Agent Callus from
Yeah.
Rebels, when he has his epiphany of when he's trapped on the ice planet with Zeb, and then sees when Zeb is rescued by his rebel cells, sees how warm they are and how much of a family they are, and he goes back to his Imperial ship, and he's sitting there alone in his room, and like none of his associates like come to check on him and say, like, hey, are you okay after that ice planet thing? Right? The aloneness of him sitting in his room and Dedra sitting in her cell, like that was to me a beautiful parallel. I don't know if it's intentional, but I drew that inspiration that like Callus was able to turn away from the Empire in that moment when he realized.
Yeah.
And he joins the rebellion after that. And it's a good redemption story in Star Wars. If you're into
And
that, like
I think there's definitely probably some level of intentionality to it because there's a third time it happens, which is Crosshair. When Crosshair and the Bad Batch comes back and realizes like maybe he should have been with his brothers and he is just alone, whereas we see all the others together. I want to read one quote from Gilroy about Syril, that I think underscores so much what we're talking about here. Gilroy said, "It's so elementally Greek and dramatic that the thing you've based your life on doesn't even recognize you." We were talking about the one line we haven't even mentioned, which is that very much in that Thanos, like, you've destroyed my whole life. I don't even know who you are. Cassian has no idea who Syril is. Cyril's always been hunting him from the background. Cassian's never realized it. And it just breaks Syril further that this person who his whole life has been around chasing doesn't know who he is. Continuing the quote, "Everything he's constructed for himself doesn't even have any awareness of him. I think he's just stunned. He can't even breathe at that point. There's the guy that ruined my life that I was chasing for 4 years, and I'll be like this raccoon in a relentless fight, and I'll be able to kill him. And then, oh my God, he doesn't even know who I am. It seemed like the absolute essential summation of poor Cyril's life."
yeah, the Thanos versus Scarlet Witch. I also go back to the Street Fighter movie,
Right.
where Bison delivers the line, "For me, it was a Tuesday."
Yeah.
Just these classic moments of like, you're nothing to me.
Right.
And I think it mirrors how Cyril and Dedra,
Yeah.
Like in their final confrontation, he realizes I like that their relationship, the foundation is a lie, right? Or that he's not important to her.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating romantic relationship, right? The way that it is portrayed. And I think he realizes like the two people that he thought were the most important to him in his life in a strange
Right.
way, Cassian and Dedra. Like he's nothing to either of them.
Yeah. And I think through Dedra, it's very much personal about her, but it's also about the Empire. You know, he wants to be noticed by the Empire. He wants the Empire to see. You know, everyone else has told him he's wrong for being so rigid, but he wants the Empire to say, "No, you're right. We like you. You get to be part of our group now."
Yeah. That that
But instead, the Empire just uses him as a tool, and they're ready to throw him away.
part of this is my personal projection, but
Mm-hmm.
I feel like Cyril thought he was going to get to join the ISB
Yes,
through this. Like, if I
100%.
show that I'm a good spy, I'm a good soldier, then I can join the ISB, which is what he aspires to, right? Like this authority.
Yeah.
And he talks about his meeting with Partagas. This is the best day of my life. And then the line that really hit in Cyril and Dedra's final confrontation is she tells him, "You didn't seem to mind the promotions."
Yeah.
Is throwing it back at him. And like
Mm-hmm.
her face in that scene, like she immediately realizes like how much she hurts him with that line because
Yeah.
she doesn't know him well. I think she realizes like he thinks like he can join the ISB, and she's like, no, like you were never going to join the ISB, but I got you these promotions in your fuel standards job, and like that's the best you're ever going to be is a bureaucrat. Like you're never going to be a spy. And it just cuts him, and then like and then Cassian says, "Who are you?" And it's the same thing, just like you're nobody. Like you're still
Mm-hmm.
just this pencil pusher.
And that's not something Gilroy invented. That is 100% straight from the pages of history. You know, if you look at Hitler's rise, again and again, there are people who he brings in as his like second in command, and because he needs them at that time until he rises one rung higher and can get someone better and throws them aside and blames them for something, or you know, a thing he knew about, like you know, there are things you know, all of a sudden he cares about some part of them that other people would hate that he didn't care about until that moment. You know, whatever it was. And look at also, you know, even in much more recent history, like the number of people who have been part of Trump's orbit and have left that orbit to be thrown aside because someone else there. All these are people who want to be, they want to be the guy that center of authority looks at and says, "You're my guy." You know, they want the closeness to power, and that is just a huge part of what the Emperor does, what Vader does, what it's not as much Vader, but like what all these people do under authoritarianism, both in real life and in the fiction of Star Wars, is they give people that promise of, you're going to get to sit at the big kids table. You're going to get to be my new, you know, chief of staff or my new head of ISB, or just like one rung higher.
Yeah.
And then throws them aside.
Yeah, and the other thing that this show did really well was show or not show the Emperor. Right? There was a lot of speculation, like, are we going to get a scene with Palpatine? No, because the way that they used the Emperor, they used his name, is actually like such a great reflection of fascism and the power deriving from the one leader. I think in the first episode, director Krennic, who is kind of like the highest person we see in the show physically, like from the Empire, holds a meeting, which is basically the Wannsee conference,
Yep.
from Nazi history. He holds a meeting where he's like, "This is how we're gonna deal with the Gorman, and this is how we're gonna steal their calcite minerals."
Right.
And he, at the very beginning of a meeting, he name drops the Emperor, and I think the Emperor's energy project. And so he is deriving authority from using the Emperor's name and his connection, and is hoarding it over the people in this room and saying, "That's why I'm better than you. That's why I'm at the head of this table, and you're all going to listen to me." And later on, there's a scene where Partagas also mentions the Emperor. Like, I had a meeting with the Emperor, and like he thinks this is very important. and that's how he derives his authority over his subordinates.
And I think that's the brilliance, because you're right, he never appears on screen, but he's present in the room almost any time Imperial officials are talking, and that includes even the rebels. You know, when Mon Mothma and Bail are talking about what they do, like knowing what the Emperor might do is just always a constant threat, always a constant awareness. And Pertagaz, you know, takes the action he does to end his life because he knows he's gonna have to face the Emperor. You know, Dedra, like even in Rogue One, which I think we really understand now is basically Andor season 3. You know, when Tarkin and Krennic are arguing with each other, they talk about like which one of us gets to report to the Emperor. You know, does Tarkin get to tell the story, or does Krennic get to tell the story? Because they know the Emperor's not going to be impartial.
And then Krennic goes to Vader. Like he tries to like undercut Tarkin by going to Vader, and then Vader's like, "Nah, like I'm not going to get involved in this." What was the line? Don't choke on your. Be careful not to choke on your ambition, Director Krennic.
Aspirations, yeah.
Yeah, it was a great line. And what you said about the rebels too, like Mon Mothma's speech at the Senate directly attacks the Emperor. The monster in the room is Emperor Palpatine.
Yeah.
Right, and that's what's important here. Is like ultimately the Empire is a Hydra.
Right.
Where you cut off one head and two take its place. And so you can take out all of the Krennics and the Tarkins, but you gotta take out the Emperor. Like that is the story being told here.
Yeah,
and you gotta take him out twice, apparently. Double shot, double tap.
And I think that's very important, because what we see in this world and in our own is the part of why you do this. You have your people fight with each other, is so that and this what the book talks about, the Emperor keeping kind of hands off, is, let's say everything didn't go well. He could be like, oh my God, I can't believe Tarkin misused the Death Star in that terrible way. We have punished Tarkin. We will never allow someone like Tarkin to have a weapon like that again, because I would have never ordered the destruction of Alderaan. You know, that kind of insulation. By the time the Death Star comes along, the Emperor doesn't care about that anymore. But these history books and stuff talk about how it happened all the time in the early years of the Empire and things like that.
Well, yeah, in the Bad Batch, Admiral Rampart is responsible for the destruction of Tapoka City. And he was following orders, right? Back to that phrase, he was following orders. But when it's discovered and when it's outed, it is still the fledgling empire, and the Senate is like, that's not right. And the Emperor throws Rampart under the bus. And it's like, he did it on his own. He's under arrest. We're cool.
Yeah, very much so.
And I think in the book, because I read the book too, and one of my favorite parts is about Mas Ameda, who is like the best Star Wars character that we continually don't get to see.
Yeah.
Like he appears in the prequel trilogy and maybe like says a line or two to the Senate. But he's like this central figure in Emperor Palpatine's power structure, and we just like don't get any of him, possibly partly because he's a big alien, so it's hard to like have him in live action stuff. But he's basically the Emperor's secretary.
Yeah.
And he controls like all of the meetings that these people, the Krennics and the Partagazes, have with the Emperor. He's the one that's scheduling them, and he is giving people their power through their meetings with the Emperor. But ultimately, that means he doesn't have any power of his own. And what the book describes is like after Endor, after the Emperor died, a lot of people thought Mas Ameda would be the successor because he was so close to power. But ultimately, like, he didn't accrue any power of his own. It all derived from the Emperor. So everyone in the Empire was like, well, we don't care about him anymore because he doesn't control the means to the power. So we're just going to take our own power.
Yeah, he's the literal definition of a figurehead, of a puppet. And the Aftermath trilogy also goes further into that, about how he's kind of ruling Coruscant, but he really has no power. And in some way, he's still a puppet, but he's supposed to be like the Emperor, the people who want to bring back the Empire or Project Cinder or whatever it is, that they can do all that in secret because Mas Ameda is the public face. So this has been a great discussion. It's about an hour. We're not going to do bonus content. I promise we'll be getting back to that starting next week, but just with Andor coming out, as well as my baby showers this weekend. So there's just a lot of stuff going on right now. But Riki, any last things you want to say as part of this conversation?
Yeah, I want to say, to go back to who we started with, Syril Karn. It is okay to like and enjoy bad characters,
Mm-hmm.
or evil characters, I guess. Like, I think he's a good character. He's a well-written, well-acted character, but I think he's ultimately like falls on the side of evil.
Yeah.
There was definitely possibilities, I believe, that he could have become good, that he could have joined the rebellion, could have had a redemption. It didn't happen in what we saw. And so, like, ultimately we have to judge this character's arc on what we did see. I think it was evil. But it's okay to enjoy that. Just examine it within yourself and examine your feelings on like why you like him and why you think like he could have had a redemption. And that's, I think that's the important part of this discussion, because I brought this subject to you because there's a lot of people who are like, Syril did nothing wrong, or like he was a good person. Like, no, I don't think so. The funniest one to me I saw was that Syril isn't a fascist. He just supported fascism. If he had grown up in the Republic, he wouldn't have been a fascist. And it's like, oh, okay, like that's like the strangest definition like you could come up with. Like, if you support fascism, you're a fascist.
Especially because unless he's a child prodigy, he did grow up at least part of his life in the Republic, you know? I think that's true. And I think that, some of the arguments about him can become fairly misogynistic in terms of it's all Dedra and his mother's fault. You showed me something of someone even defending Pendergrass, saying like, I've seen some takes that are like, Pendergrass ends himself because he hears Nemik's speech and realizes he's been wrong this whole time and the rebellion should flourish. No, that's not what that means at all. It's he realizes how much he's failed. He realizes how much this has spread, and he's going to get blamed for it. He's going to get tortured, and as the same reason why the Grand Inquisitor lets go of that cliff in Rebels, because there are fates worse than death. And to me, I think I think there's two elements of it. It's important that we recognize, that he's not an evil person we can wag our fingers at. It's that he's someone who could be like us if we don't make better choices, but also that he's a product of the system that he's in. And, people talk a lot about propaganda, and I don't necessarily underline all the conversations about that. Cyril's a great example of why a lot of us say, like, we should be a little more critical of the media we consume around, like, cops and soldiers always doing the right thing, and it's all these factors that go in. So yeah, I'm really glad we brought up this topic. I would really love to hear listener feedback on it. I think we're going to get a lot more about these conversations. And Riki, thank you so much for bringing it up. Thank you so much to our listeners for being a part of all this. We have spoken.
Stoneman Sky.